Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Abortion on the Ballot, a webinar hosted by the Center on Reproductive Health Law and Policy here at UCLA Law. I'm very excited to pass this over to Melissa Goodman, who is our Executive Director. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you, Carly, and thank you everyone for being here. Hello, I am Melissa. As Carly said, I am the new director of the Center on Reproductive Health Law and Policy here at UCLA Law. And just for folks who might not know us as well, we are a nationwide think tank and interdisciplinary research center created to meet the current national crisis in access to abortion, while also working toward long-term solutions to advance reproductive justice. We conduct analysis and research for legal, policy, and narrative change. And we also serve as a trusted hub for convening and engaging folks like academics, advocates, healthcare providers, policymakers, and community members, all with the goal of reimagining the landscape of reproductive health law and policy. We also train the reproductive law and policy leaders of tomorrow, and hopefully in doing so, we'll be increasing the capacity of the reproductive health and reproductive justice movements. So that's what we do. And today we are here to talk about what abortion on the ballot looked like on Tuesday. And the short answer is that it looked pretty damn good, which is nice. We were saying before we started, we're very excited to bring a webinar to you that has some pretty good news attached. So we saw a very significant win in Ohio, where voters enshrined a right to abortion in the state constitution. We saw abortion being a very salient driving issue in big Democratic wins in Virginia legislative races, the Kentucky governor race, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court election, and possibly more. We'll hear more about that. Today, what we're going to talk about is what happened and lessons learned for future abortion-specific ballot fights ahead. We'll hear about substance, process, hurdles, especially in sort of overcoming all the democracy-blocking hurdles thrown up in the way, especially in the Ohio campaign. But we'll also talk more broadly about how abortion is playing and impacting candidate elections, how abortion is growing as a top motivator for voters in ways, well, the panelists will tell me if I'm wrong about this, but in ways it feels like we haven't seen, for quite some time, what we're learning about messaging and generally what we might look out for and expect for the 2024 races. So that is our goal today, to have a conversation. And I just wanted to let folks know who are listening in that we do intend to leave ample time at the end for questions. Our aim is to have at least 15 minutes for that. So if you do have questions throughout, we'll address them at the end, and you should put them in the Q&A box. But with that, I'm elated to have this incredible group of humans and experts to talk about this today. And I'm just going to have everyone, Jennifer, Celinda, Maggie, introduce themselves and share with you briefly their unique experience and perspective that brings them to this conversation today. I'm going to start. I'll go Maggie, Jennifer, Celinda.
Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. My name is Maggie. I use she, they pronouns. I'm the interim executive director at the Abortion Fund of Ohio. I'm also an attorney in the state of Ohio. And Abortion Fund of Ohio is the only statewide abortion fund and practical support organization for the state of Ohio. We're going to be serving roughly 3,000 Ohioans this year, which is 3 times what we served 2 years ago. And we also run the state's judicial bypass and legal support helpline.
Thank you, Maggie, and congratulations.
Yes,
Jennifer.
Hi, thank you, Melissa. I'm Jennifer Driver. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Senior Director of Reproductive Rights with the State Innovation Exchange. The State Innovation Exchange is a national organization that works with state legislators in every state. I oversee the Reproductive Health Rights and Justice team, and we have the Reproductive Freedom Leadership Council, which is about roughly 800 state legislators who are championing reproductive health rights and justice in their state.
Thank you. Celinda.
I'm Celinda Lake, and I'm a pollster, and we were lucky enough to work with the doctors in the coalition on polling along with Global Strategy Group. And Maggie made the data look really good. So thank you, Maggie, and congrats. And Jennifer always makes the data look good. So thank you. I feel very honored to be on this panel. We have done a variety. We also worked on abortion and the response to the 15-week strategy in Virginia, and I want to acknowledge the great leadership of Andrea Miller, who passed away suddenly and was really an amazing, innovative leader and the author of that work. So I hope she feels in heaven the joy of those victories, which she very much helped create. And then we have also used, one thing you didn't mention, Melissa, is abortion has played a big role in a lot of mayoral races, and we've been involved in several of those. So people keep asking, and I love it, when are people going to get tired of abortion? And I always say, well, until people get tired of sex, I don't think they're getting tired of abortion. But anyway, back to the panel. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Celinda. And we'll make sure to talk about the mayors too. And we never want anyone to get tired of the topic. So thank you. We're going to go lots of different places in this conversation, but I am going to start us off with Ohio. And Maggie, that means I got a few questions for you. First and foremost, if you could share with folks, some people on this webinar have been deeply involved in campaigns, some, not as much. Can you just tell us sort of, one, how you're feeling and what you think this means for Ohioans and for all of us? We're going to spend a lot of time on this panel talking about sort of the political implications and what it sort of means structurally and big picture, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this really means something for real people. So can you just tell us how you're feeling and how you feel about what it really means for folks on the ground?
Yeah. In terms of how I'm feeling, I'm tired. I won't lie. This has been a really long, really hard fight. The last year and a half in Ohio has been really, really rough. It didn't start when the 6-week ban went into effect last summer, but it certainly got a lot harder when that happened. But I'm really excited. I had the honor of getting to spend election night with my patient navigation team, who are all abortion storytellers themselves, who help abortion seekers navigate and get care every single day. And I got to hold them while they realized that they wouldn't have to turn people away again, which was really impactful. When our 6-week ban went into effect, we had to turn people away all weekend and tell them they couldn't get care, and it was heartbreaking for all of us. And so getting to be with abortion storytellers, some of who had to leave the state to access care under the 6-week ban, and getting to know with them that they would be able to have full maternal health care throughout their pregnancy this time, and get to see what that meant for them and their partners and our community has been just incredible. This gives us a fighting chance in the state of Ohio. It's not at all the end of the fight. Our legislators have been out all day talking about how excited they are to try and ruin this win for us. But this will give us a fighting chance, and it will allow us to continue to build access in the state of Ohio without the fear of a 6-week ban hanging over our head every single day.
Well, thank you. One more question just for you, and then I'm going to open a few questions up to everybody. And it's sort of a broad question, but did things go the way you were expecting? Based on how it was looking at the ground, either sort of early on or, in the couple days leading up, were there any big surprises? Anything you're feeling about how it went compared to what you expected?
Yeah, I don't think there were a ton of big surprises. Abortion is really popular, and it stays pretty consistently popular. And so that was really good to hear. And honestly, being able to be in the weeds talking to voters during this election, you could see how important this issue was to everybody, whether it was conservative voters, people who were rural, people who were in urban centers. Everybody knew how important this election was. And there was so much vulnerability that voters and organizers and storytellers were showing to each other, that I think it was really incredible to just watch the reality of what abortion and reproductive health care is really overcome a lot of fear mongering that we saw in this election.
Can you share a little bit? Actually, I'm going to open this up to everybody next. I want to talk a little bit about like messages and stories that seem really salient for people, but also hear something about the turnout. But because Maggie, you were just talking about sort of the storytellers on the ground, were there particular stories or approaches that you all were seeing really work, or with people, either to turn them out or to move them?
Yeah, we were incredibly lucky to have one of our own former clients who had to leave the state during the 6-week ban be able to be a spokesperson for us. Beth and Kyle are an amazing couple, and they had a very much wanted but unviable pregnancy that they had to grieve and deal with while being forced to leave the state. And it was really wonderful to start seeing people opening up about their reproductive healthcare journeys, and talking to each other about reproductive healthcare and what it means in their lives, and not buying into the kind of fear-mongering, very politicized messaging that's based in, stigmatizing good versus bad abortions or good versus bad healthcare, and really just getting down to talking about these decisions and what these decisions look like in our families when we make them. And we were so lucky to have incredible storytellers like Beth and Kyle, like Jordan Close, who's the deputy director of Ohio Women's Alliance, telling their own stories about abortion and really moving this conversation forward in a heart forward and vulnerable way.
Melissa, if I can add to Maggie's comment, one of the things I think that Montana did very well in 2020, and then Ohio did remarkably well in 2023, or I mean, Montana did in 2022, I'm sorry, is they also use the voice of the doctors. And these doctors, the combination of people in their personal journeys and the doctors is just amazing. And the doctors have had much on their plate and not been as involved in the campaigns. And it's time after time again, state after state, their voices and their ads are among the best testing, and it's really authoritative, and it can turn back so much of the other side's strategy. I would also like to just take a second, because Maggie is being too modest, I think, there were two things that really surprised me. One thing that really surprised me, and it's not legal in a lot of states, is that the coalition in Ohio faced a situation where they tried to change the rules, and that was pushed back on. Then they rewrote the language to be completely misrepresenting, and the polling shifted from being ahead to being behind, and they were successful in reframing. I mean, rewriting the language completely after people have signed petitions, that should be illegal. And yet they resoundingly won. And I think that is, so that the audacity of Ohio stunned me, and the resounding voice of the Ohio people is really something to be remarked on in that context.
Well, thank you for raising that, Celinda. I do want to, in a couple minutes, I actually want to talk more systemically about all the hurdles and barriers, because I think the kind of outrageous kind of playbook that we saw in Ohio is, for better or worse, things I think we're going to see again. So I'm going to put a pin in that and definitely go there. But I want to open it up more generally. Jennifer, if you have anything to add, or Celinda or Maggie, more to say on things we sort of learned about messaging, or kind of good and bad, things that motivated people, things people trying to, have an anti-abortion stand we're using that worked or didn't. Would love to talk about that, and then I'll turn to turnout.
I'm happy to jump in and talk really broadly. I think Maggie is right. For a long time, what a lot of us in this space knew is that abortion was and is a winning issue, and it obviously galvanized a lot of voters to turn out, even if there wasn't a ballot initiative or a referendum. Generally in non-presidential election years, voter turnout is low, especially for progressives pre-Dobbs, when the average voter didn't actually think that Roe was going to be overturned. And so what we saw on Tuesday, especially like in Kentucky's governor's race, where Andy Beshear won his second term by comfortable margins, even outperformed his first governor's run. And so this year, a lot of folks actually thought he might struggle a little bit. And I actually think it was kind of this referendum and wanting to, hold firm kind of the position that Kentucky has right now and keeping Governor Beshear. I mean, clearly there's some other factors that went into Daniel Cameron, but I still think that there was a strong showing of kind of abortion wanting to be protected in Kentucky, and voters actually knew that unseating Andy Beshear could lead to that. I also think in Virginia, there was this really strong response to Governor Youngkin's plan for a 15-week ban, despite his attempts to rebrand and not call it a ban, characterizing it as reasonable or common or limits common sense or consensus. And so doing everything he could to really rebrand and call it anything other than a ban. And I don't think voters were falling for it. Clearly they didn't, right? What I thought was interesting from Virginia, even the head of Susan B. Anthony had said, before the election that Virginia's off year would serve as a bellwether for what's to come. Well, we saw what happened there. I think for Virginia, what's really interesting is that 21 Democratic senators came in, and 11 of them will be freshmen or have served less than 1 year in the Senate. And so I think that there's a lot of power that's coming in Virginia. And then you mentioned earlier at the top, Pennsylvania and the Supreme Court race. Again, voters turning out wanting to protect abortion access in all of these states.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I think in terms of messages, we saw an affirmation of the messages that have been working, and the broad shaming that before Roe, people were interested in restrictions before Roe was overturned. Now they're really not, and they're not very supportive of restrictions because they think the fundamental right and freedom is at issue and who's in control. You saw the strong pushback against politicians interfering and putting in their own personal beliefs. And we also saw, and I think Ohio and Virginia were both really poster childs for this. We learned a lot about turning back the messages on the other side. In Ohio, they spent $5 million before we even got started trying to link abortion and transgender issues, and basically put up an ad that was quite powerful with 2 9-year-old girls supposedly getting an abortion without their parents' permission, and then on the way out the back door implying that they got gender affirming care, which was just insane. And then in Virginia, the 15-week ban, as Jennifer was mentioning, and what we found is discipline matters here. Staying on framing this issue, emphasizing that exceptions are not enough. And in the 15-week ban, which people do marginally support when they think about it on its own, by the way, Americans extremely bad at math and biology. Once we said, every pregnancy is unique, something can happen at any point in a pregnancy. This is a decision that should be made by women or pregnant people and their medical professionals, not a politician for their own political views. That just completely reversed the numbers on 15 weeks, as well as just the general voting. So I think we learned in Ohio and Virginia, we were tested by fire. And we learned that the same messages that framed the race up initially remain our best responses, and don't get diverted, don't get into weak, stay focused, stay framing the issue. And Ohio and Virginia were both extremely, and Governor Beshear, extremely disciplined in doing that. And they won solidly because of it.
And I just say one additional thing, because I live in DC, so I'm really closely to Virginia and the ads that I was seeing constantly. Right? So we saw segments of TV blocks, right? The entire thing was, political ads. And I know we're going to talk about candidates in a second, but I will say that this is the first time that I've really seen candidates, every single ad talking about abortion, protecting abortion in ways that in the past they had really avoided having these conversations. And so they leaned into this and made the stark contrast against their opponent. I am here for abortion. They actually said the word abortion. Very few of them steered away and said a right to choose. Many of them were actually using the term abortion, which I thought was really key, and comparing themselves as a person, against the other person who's going to take this away. The last thing I'll say about, the things that surprised me or actually did really surprise me was the turnout, right? What I loved about Ohio, and so many folks have kind of raised this, is the turnout of Black voters being a consistent voting bloc for abortion access, and this idea, and really rejecting the notion that you can't, that Black voters don't want to talk about abortion. Actually, we do care about abortion, and we show up time and time again to protect abortion access in states. And then again, young people constantly showing up. And so those are the things that both didn't surprise me, but was really happy to see.
That's awesome. Yeah.
You know,
and
something we also learned, I think, in both places, just to add some data to Jennifer's great points, we learned that conventional wisdom is wrong about 95% of the time, plus or minus 5%. So everybody used to know that Black voters weren't for abortion, they were conflicted. Well, in Ohio, for example, we got 83% of African-American voters. Same proportion in Virginia, high turnout. Among Latino voters, we're getting 2/3 to 3/4. Everybody knows that Latinos are cross-pressured. Everybody knows except Latino voters who aren't cross-pressured and vote solidly for abortion and birth control. So we also learned that conventional wisdom is extremely dated and wrong, and that it's become a point of almost misinformation.
Can you speak, Celinda, or anyone else, to also those numbers? I know, at least with some of the data I saw, at least with Black voters, those numbers were super high across gender too.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the rest of the data to comment on other groups, but is there anything notable gender-wise worth lifting up in terms of turnout?
Yeah, that we won both men and women in most of these places on the abortion issue. And in Ohio, 53% of men and 60% of women voted. Now, women do get a little bit more mobilized in terms of turnout and registration. But in terms of voting, this is very, very strong across gender. And if we step back here, as progressives on most issues, we win women and lose men. This is an issue where we're winning men and we're winning women. And young men in particular feel very strongly about contraception and abortion.
Maggie, I'd love to hear any of your observations on turnout, and whether it, kind of matched what you were all hoping in terms of your turnout game, and not. Would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think one of the really wonderful strengths of the coalition we had in Ohio was that we had such a wonderful, diverse coalition. We had 2 Black-led reproductive justice organizations that were really driving conversations in Black communities, having billboards across our state, empowering abortion seekers. We had community leaders in Latinx communities who were also really driving these conversations and having these conversations in community, not trying to bring them into a different space, and uplifting the voices of folks who are from that community and having really nuanced conversations. I also think there was a lot of really powerful work done by Black women in our coalition to bring in and call in a lot of white folks who had these wrong ideas about what it meant to engage with Black and Brown voters, and really engage in bringing Black men to the center and having Black men tell their stories about why abortion was important in their lives, and reminding them that this is their conversation too, right? Like, it impacts their lives as well. And really reframing. We did some early polling before the Dobbs decision came out that said roughly 80% of Republicans thought abortion didn't have any impact on their lives. And so a big part of our coalition was reaching voters who thought that this wasn't about them and making sure that they understood that it was. We also had an incredible grassroots coalition of young organizers who were on the streets every day. We saw, I think it was some astronomical rise, I don't have the number with me right now, Celinda might have it, of the increase in young voter registration in Ohio. It was through the roof how many young voters were inspired to get involved. And part of that is obviously because we had both abortion and marijuana on the ballot initiative, which was just incredible for us, honestly. But really having elections that look at the important things that folks want to talk about right now, and helping folks realize that this is a broad coalition, and the more you bring conversations of abortion out of the dark and into the center of our communities, the more folks realize how important it is for everyone in their community to have access to this care.
Thank you. All right, I'm gonna one more set of things very specific to Ohio, because for better or worse, as Celinda alluded to, I think there are some bananas things that happen process-wise in your campaign that were just like, wow, those are some new tactics, and entirely driven, from my perspective, as a transparent way to not get voters to reach these questions. So I was wondering, Maggie, and then I'll open it up to everyone because I'm sure you all have opinions on this. Can you walk us through a little bit sort of various hurdles that was thrown in the campaign's path along the way and how you navigated them? We'll talk later about what we might learn about that for future ones, but can you just talk a little bit about the bananas process in Ohio?
Yeah, one thing I will give Ohio GOP leaders is they're creative. They're creative. Once we first got our ballot amendment language approved, we faced a lawsuit claiming that it wasn't a single issue and attempting to require us to resubmit the language and recollect signatures. We were thankfully able to overcome that. But also, as soon as the GOP found out that we were planning this ballot initiative, they started planning a new ballot initiative of their own to try and make it harder to pass constitutional amendments in the state of Ohio. It would have raised the win threshold to 60%, which is conveniently just over what most abortion ballot initiatives have won by. And then also would have changed the signature requirements to make it basically nearly impossible for grassroots ballot initiatives to reach fruition. And they went so far as to schedule a special election in August that they had just outlawed a couple months prior to vote on this constitutional amendment, specifically so that it would apply to the abortion ballot initiative as well. Voters turned out in mass in August, despite having basically no planning, no infrastructure, and no notice that this election was going to happen, and overwhelmingly rejected that ballot amendment. We then also had the ballot board, who, as Celinda referenced, wrote some ballot summary language that was in fact not a summary. It was longer than our actual amendment language, and was extremely misleading. And we in fact filed a lawsuit, and the Supreme Court of Ohio ruled that the ballot board had in fact misled voters in that initial ballot language. And yet that was the language that was before Ohio voters when they voted on Tuesday. And even with that extremely misleading language, we were still able to win. We also had basically all of our elected officials full speed campaigning against issue 1, using their elected offices. We had our Secretary of State himself endorsing against issue 1 very early on. Our governor and his wife were in a ton of campaign ads. Mind you, our governor, whose son is on our Supreme Court, hearing an abortion case actively right now and has not recused himself. And we had our Attorney General, who submitted a quote unquote legal analysis that attempted to uplift and give credence to a lot of the misinformation that we were seeing in the anti-abortion campaign, and really muddy the waters for voters and make them feel confused about what this means. And so I think that's one of the reasons the win on Tuesday was so incredibly sweet, because they had really, we joke a lot at my organization that rules only apply to abortion funds sometimes, because they will just make up the rules to make them apply to us if they want them to. And that's really what we saw this year in Ohio. Our leaders were doing everything they could, and they were pretty unapologetic about how willing they were to mislead and encourage voters. I was getting notifications encouraging voters not to vote in this election, which is wild to me, from elected officials, just encouraging voters to stay home on election day because it's just not worth it. And we still won even despite all of that.
Wow. Do you think there's any ways in which all of those hurdles, I don't want to take, it's an enormous amount of like extra time, effort, and money that it takes to deal with those hurdles. I do not want to minimize that in any way. That is very significant. But on the other hand, at least from someone outside, you got to see a lot of what like the true motivation, was, and you had these voters now turning up multiple times on this issue. Do you think in any way the efforts to throw roadblocks in your way actually helped in any way?
I think it backfired on them a little bit, because it became so, especially with the timing of them removing special elections and then putting them back in. I think it was like 2 months later. It was very shortly after. And so voters were very able to see what our electeds were doing. And we had some wonderful media in the state that was doing a lot of fact checking and really bringing a lot of this to light, and allowed voters to have a really clear idea. I definitely heard that from voters, that they knew what was going on and they did not like being manipulated in this way.
I think one key, though, and you mentioned it, Maggie, in Ohio, was the tremendous united effort and bringing lawyers, bringing law professors, bringing doctors, bringing all of the people who were abortion providers to the table. This was one of the best efforts I've ever seen at getting right on top of misinformation and pushing back on it. And I think, first of all, it was astounding the amount of it there was. But really, there were more good press stories than I've ever seen. And it wasn't because the Ohio press is so great. It was because the misinformation pushback was so united, so aggressive, so thoughtful, so disciplined, so staffed. And I really think it's the poster child for that kind of effort. And we're going to need that in 2024 on steroids.
That's right. I also think that, what happened in Ohio, a lot of national media, drew attention to it, of how dishonest, right, anti-abortion legislators, lawmakers, governors are, and the ways that they try to thwart democracy. I think, voting is one of the foundations of the democracy, right? And if you looked at what happened across the board and Tuesday, not only what had been happening in Ohio, even like, we were talking earlier about, Mississippi, where there were lines and lines of folks standing trying to vote, particularly in Hinds County, one of the largest Black counties, 83% of Black voters there. And not only do you have long lines, but you run out of ballots. Like, how is that a thing in 2023? Not just one time, but like 5 times of getting additional ballots and still not having enough. And there was this, oh, we didn't expect this many turn. Like, how is that a thing? That's not a viable excuse. I think you can look at my home state of Alabama, where they had to come back and redistrict and redraw the map so that we could have a congressional district for Black voters. And so I think, time and time again, voters are showing up, and Republicans are looking for ways to really thwart that. Even in Ohio, like, it passed that night, you already heard them talking about overturning this and looking for ways to go against what the voters want. We have in Michigan, right, where they're already talking about going against the constitutional amendment. And so no matter what, even when the voters are saying, this is what we want, we voted for this, we clearly affirmed this, the antis are not satisfied until they get what they want, regardless of how we voted.
And Maggie knows this firsthand. In Ohio, too, they threw a bunch of people off the rolls.
Right.
This is their tactic, too. And
we got a new voter ID law that went into
right.
last year.
That's right. So this is when abortion is on the line on the ballot. Frankly, democracy is on the ballot, too. There is no question about that. The handbook is clear.
Also, and I think that's what voters saw, is that our elected officials were willing to throw out the democracy handbook in order to restrict abortion. And I think that really upset a lot of people, that it felt like this could happen to anybody if they're willing to just entirely throw the rules out the window.
I mean, other states,
something. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, other states similar to Mississippi, they were willing to do a ballot, have ballot initiatives, but you could not have abortion be part of that, right? So anything to keep abortion, because they know how widely popular abortion is, that it will pass. And so they're looking for every opportunity to add more barriers to be able to access abortion.
The other thing I want to say here that's important, and it segues, Melissa, to your point about turnout. In 2022, we saw real complacency on the anti-abortion side, and they thought they had won. And our side roaring out to turn out to reinforce Maggie's point. In 2023, we saw some increased turnout among the anti-abortion folks, but we were still beating them in terms of increased turnout by more than 20%. So this is still far more in the post-Dobbs world. this is still far more energizing to our side than their side. And frankly, the conservatives and the MAGA Republicans have no idea what they unleashed. And they were not prepared for this at all. And every strategy that they've tried has failed and been resoundingly turned back, not by sneaky tricks and misinformation campaigns, but by the voters themselves having their voice.
So Melissa, I know you're trying to get, I'm just
No, it's fine. I want to hear from you all.
Rick Santorum was like that key person that had said, I have no idea why Ohio put marijuana and abortion on the ballot at the same time. A pure democracy is no way to run a country. I mean, they're saying it out loud, you know, they're not even hiding it.
No, I'm glad you said that, because actually the only thing I was going to say is that I love that we're having this conversation, because, you know, in like legal circles, you know, you hear a lot about, you know, the Supreme Court's idea that, oh no, we're just saying we're taking it to the voters, right? Well, it's not like a pure democratic fight, right? Like, they're not accepting democratic outcomes. There's continued fighting. And what does that really mean? It's becoming more and more transparent, I think.
They knew what they were doing, right? When they voted the Voting Rights Act, right? And maps were drawn the way they were, voting access was restricted. They've, you know, not allowed formerly incarcerated folks to vote, you know, in a lot of these states. They knew exactly what they were doing when they were turning it back to the states. And so I don't think that this surprises any of us. It just means that we're having to be more strategic and more coordinated. And to Celinda's point, you know, the antis on the other side, we're not prepared following Dobbs of like what their messaging should be.
Well, and you know, one of the things that's great is we're talking about and lifting up all these states where there were severe restrictions and bans. But what we're going to see in 2024 and what we saw in 2022 is that people who were in states that protected abortion voted abortion in the candidate races. It is not acceptable to be for a ban on abortions now in most states. And those candidates are at risk of losing, even in states where people are confident abortion will be protected. And if, for example, the U.S. House of Representatives changes hands, which I think it will be because of the abortion issue. It's already quite clear. And if senators are saved, they will be saved because of abortion issues. I mean, new data out of Arizona showing that this mobilizes voters and younger voters. That helps Ruben Gallego. And they know this. That's why they're trying to shut down voting. That's why they're trying to beat these initiatives. They're trying to change the rules now in Arizona. They know they have created a nightmare for themselves.
I'm glad you went there, because I actually loved for us to, I'm going to have us kind of like look backward and look forward at the same time. I'd love to get in a little bit more deeply into what we are now seeing ballot measure wise. We're going to go to candidate elections in a minute, but ballot measure wise in 2024, what's it looking like right now? There's a lot of things happening, a lot of energy. And what do you think, not just learning from Ohio, but, you know, the long string of ballot measure victories, both affirmative and beating back bad things in 2022, big picture, what do we think we're sort of learning from that? And what is it looking like in 2024 so far?
I'm happy to kick us off and then pass it, just because it doesn't work deeply on ballot measures, but of the ones that I'm familiar with, right? But there's Florida, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, Nebraska have all qualifications efforts underway. Florida being the first one up, where Floridians Protecting Freedom has validated, over 500,000 signatures towards, the 800, almost 900,000 state signatures required by February 1st to qualify for the 2024 ballot. In addition to Florida, we've got Arizona and Nebraska who are seeking to restore access that has been lost or could be imminently. Nevada and Colorado ballot initiatives will seek to expand by repealing existing restrictions, as well as affirming the right to reproductive freedom. And then, just a side note, New York voters in 2024 around the ERA. I think, one of the things that I have seen that I have like a love-hate relationships with ballot measures, right? Because I think people see the successes out of Ohio. We are shouting, we are so excited for Ohio and for folks who weren't on the ground in Ohio and haven't been deeply entrenched in like what happened and everything that went into it, folks are like, I want to run a ballot measure, right? I want to do a ballot initiative. I had someone email me not like 20 minutes after the ballot they called for Ohio, they were like, we're going to file tomorrow. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what coalition are you part of? Who are you connected with? Because ballot measures are really expensive to run, and they are not always the answer and the solution in states. And so I just always caution folks. I think that there's a coordinated effort, there's expense, there's a lot that goes into it. And I think we've seen so much success. But I just always kind of, that's my caveat to folks, that they're expensive and a lot of coordination that go into them.
Maggie, could you speak to that a little bit? Just coming so fresh out of it. I mean, there's this like beauty, glorious moment, but like there's a lot of labor, time, effort.
Yeah, a lot of money, a lot of money, millions and millions and millions of dollars. And you know, to Jennifer's point, I think it can look really exciting from the outside, but it's a really serious undertaking. And there was a lot of debate within our coalition about whether or not we should go in 2023 or go in 2024. And a big part of that was, would we have the time? Going in 2023 meant we had 3 months to collect over 500,000 signatures from Ohioans. And we were able to do it, and it was incredible for us. But we didn't know if we were going to be able to do it when we started it. And because it takes so much of your energy, you know, we had a coalition of 9 repro organizations, including the doctors' organizations, and all of us were working, you know, 70 hours a week to try and get this done. On top of, you know, I work at a direct service organization, so we're still serving patients every day. And now we're having to compete with a ballot initiative for fundraising. And that meant there was less money for us to give to patients. And so while I'm not, you know, I'm very happy that we have the constitutional amendment, I wouldn't change what we did. It is something serious for folks to consider, because if we were lucky that we had the funds to be able to keep going this year, but not all abortion funds are that lucky and will have the investment prior to be able to survive the fundraising competition. And now all of our voters are tapped out. So we're going into one of our biggest fundraisers of the year, and nobody in our state has a lot of money to give to us right now. And so we're going to have to try and figure out what that means for our fundraising. But it's just something to be really thoughtful about when you're doing this work, and also being aware of what these conversations can do. While there's been a lot of wonderful conversations around abortion in the state of Ohio, there's also been a lot of stigmatizing of abortion in the state of Ohio, and it's caused a lot of harm and a lot of pain to a lot of abortion storytellers, especially the Black women who were leading this movement, who had to do a lot of the work educating folks. And you know, campaigns are not generally good places for stigma busting work to happen. And so you have to be really thoughtful about whether or not that work has been done in advance, and whether or not the campaign can commit to doing that work to protect the state after the campaign is over.
I want to really underscore what you just said, Maggie. I think that's so important. And the other thing I would add is, as we go into 2024, and we may have a variety of feelings about specific candidates or whatever, but we need to take back Congress, and we need to elect a Democratic president. We need to get this passed nationally. It's too great a use of resources to try to do this patchwork. Lots of states don't have the initiative process. We need a national protection here. There's been, you know, people, astounding organizations that have risen to the cause, as people have had to move from state to state, but it's at great harm and great hardship to people. So I hope that all the energy that it's easy to put into initiatives, because there's nothing people like better than voting directly on the issue, also gets put into understanding we need to elect a pro-choice president. We need to make sure that we don't get diverted by third-party candidates who may be appealing for other reasons. We need to elect a pro-choice Congress and keep a pro-abortion Senate, so we can get this thing dealt with nationally once and for all.
I also think we need to pay attention more to state courts, right?
Yes.
So much reliance on the federal, which, you know, I appreciate someone who worked at the federal level for such a long time. And while Congress is so stalled, state courts, state legislatures, like if you don't know who your state legislator is, look them up, like let's figure this out together. Because those are the ones that are on the front lines. They're the ones that are passing the bills that are moving so quickly. These things move at lightning speed, and the folks on the ground are the ones that are going to be able to defend or expand in the absence. I mean, I think about even with President Biden, like our protest, whoever the president is, how long it took them to even say the word abortion, right? And so I just think that we need to be thinking both at the federal level, but also those state courts really do matter.
To Jennifer's point, I don't think we could have run this campaign in Ohio if we didn't have a preliminary injunction on our 6-week ban. We would not have been able to have the support from our direct service providers. And we had that preliminary injunction because of a state court judge. And that's the only reason we were able to do this. It's what allowed us to have access in the interim and continue to serve folks and not get because that's part of their strategy, right? If you're so busy fighting to stay alive, you can't fight for your political rights. And so I 100% what Jennifer just said. And they're the ones who are going to be interpreting the state constitution, right? Like we still have a Republican Supreme Court in the state of Ohio who's going to be interpreting this constitutional amendment. And I don't necessarily trust them to interpret it fairly. They certainly haven't treated the other, the ballot summary that we saw very fairly. They couldn't even have a full opinion on that. It had to be a per curiam opinion because they're so divided. So I think absolutely including state court judges is absolutely necessary.
Thanks for that. I want to ask this question as sort of maybe a bridge from we're very focused on ballot measures to candidate elections. So I'll ask it as a bridge, and then I want to talk about candidate elections. It sounds like, for better or worse, there are some pitfalls. And adding to the money thing, now having to also fight all these structural, like, democracy busting kind of tactics is also a whole layer of like money and energy and time that a lot of campaigns don't build in, right? But it sounds like we're going to likely see a fair number of ballot measures specific to abortion on state ballots in 2024. Just speaking very generally, what impact, positive or negative, do we feel like that's going to have for 2024 elections? I want to go there, and then we'll talk about candidate elections.
I think it's going to be one of the most important. Well, I'm going to make the linkage. I think these ballot issues are going to be one of the most important issues in candidate races. When candidates are fighting back and forth about who's good on the economy, who's good on inflation, who's got a good economic plan, voters are like, whoa, I can't make a difference. What's really great about the abortion issue is it's clear, and voters are not in the mood to hear muffled answers. They want clarity. And frankly, these MAGA Republicans are saying some amazing things. The Republican who ran against the Attorney General in Michigan said, there's no medical diagnosis that ever has an abortion. It's like, thank you. When you get your medical degree, I'll be interested in your opinion on that. So I think there is a linkage here. And one of the things that initiatives do is they help frame up the race. And it can be often the second most important issue in the state after the economy or education, because it's such a clear, voters are just in the mood, just tell me yes or no, I don't want all this bullshit. The second thing it does is it makes a huge difference in turnout. And we've got some real problems mobilizing young voters for obvious reasons, and they're becoming more acute. This is a measure that really does help mobilize young people and get them registered, and young women in particular, and young people of color. So it can fundamentally shape and change the contours of all of the candidate races. And what's really been interesting, my last point, is voters don't care what office you're running for. They think this is a criteria. So we've utilized the abortion issue in a ton of mayoral races. And sometimes the candidates are hesitant. They'll go, well, I don't really have anything to do with abortion as the mayor of Lincoln. And the voter's like, I don't care. I want to know where you stand on it. And if you care about what I care about, you tell me what you think. And so in Chicago, in Houston, in Lincoln, across the board in these mayoral elections and lower level races, county commission races, people are voting the abortion issue because they think it is a fundamental indicator of whose side you're on, whether you believe in democracy, whether you are going to interfere in people's lives, whether you believe in freedom for people to make their own decisions. So it's a very strong, these initiatives can be very strong in mobilizing voters, persuading swing voters, and framing up contests for candidates.
I think that's something Celinda said that I think is so important, of like, when you feel that your life has not changed in other ways, right, from the economy or others, this is a thing where you can firmly say, I don't want my rights taken away. And I absolutely believe that folks will turn out for this. Otherwise, you can sit and be like, you know what, it doesn't really matter if I vote or not, because my life hasn't gotten any better with the economy. I'm still, milk is still like $8 a gallon, right? But this, you can actually see, I don't want this taken away from me. And so I'm going to therefore show up for this issue.
One thing that's very interesting too is voters firmly believe, what I love about voters, they're usually way ahead of the elected officials. So voters firmly believe this is a slippery slope. They don't think it stops here. You don't even have to make that argument. Voters volunteered. It's like, yeah, today this, and then tomorrow this. So voters are taking a stand now for something that's very important to them, but also that they think is making a stance about a broader set of freedoms.
I want to dive in a little deeper here, only because we've talked a little bit about what is sort of, I'm reading as sort of a shift and a change, but can anyone talk a little bit more historically? Like, has abortion been a primary driver for most people in candidate elections? Is it wildly different now? Is it just slightly different? Like, what has that looked like historically?
It's wildly different now than it was before Dobbs, because before Dobbs, the people that were energized were the so-called pro-life people, the anti-abortion people, not our side. Our side was very complacent. It's wildly changed because people were willing to entertain restrictions. It's like, well, we have the right. And people, until Dobbs was overturned, people were in complete denial. It's like, no, that's never going back. We don't take things away. We don't go backward in this country for better or for worse. People thought it was quite un-American, the Dobbs decision. And people thought it's valuable to know, but people were thought, well, there may be other issues that are more important or more relevant because this is guaranteed already. Or they thought, I don't believe you. Like in the California congressional races, when Planned Parenthood was working hard to beat back some anti-choice Republicans, people said, no, not a woman. Like we tried to beat Congresswoman Kim, and it was like, no, she's a Korean California Republican. She's not a Mississippi Republican. There's no way she's anti-abortion. And so people were skeptical. Now they're not. People thought, I don't need to make this a criteria. It's taken care of. Now they know it's not. And people will vote it and turn out for it.
I'm going to say a thing that I'm just going to say it, right? It's not just the antis, right? Our side thought that, when I was working at the federal level, under the two administrations, I remember us going to the Obama administration and saying, hey, we need to shore up abortion. And there were political officials that were like, abortion is settled. That is not the issue that we need to focus on. And so many of us in the repro space were so frustrated because we were saying, no, this is absolutely, we need to protect it. There will come a day. And so there were, political folks, there were movement, other folks. I've been doing this work for, years. My own mother was like, Jennifer, Roe's not going to be overturned. And I was like, Mom, I talk to you daily. What did you think? And then so it happened, right? And so, I just think now our side really is galvanized because they saw that this could be taken away. And then they don't want anything else to be taken away, right? I also think that now, as we talk about messaging and, building back beyond Roe, we know that Roe was the concession, right? And so now what does it look like for us to expand even further? And that's the visionary piece that we are trying to really communicate.
I want to go in two different directions from that. You brought me in both. I'd actually love to talk more about, you were saying sort of like the visionary piece. I think another shift, though you all will correct me if I'm wrong, that we're seeing, and at least one of you alluded to it earlier, is that not only are people voting with this issue in mind more frequently, but that we're also seeing people are shifting from a like, just get out of this issue entirely government, right? Or getting to a place where it's like, no bans, no restrictions. I feel that way anecdotally. I feel like there might be some data that's starting to support that. Can anyone speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, the data shows that people are moving pretty aggressively against restrictions, and that's different than regulations, by the way. I mean, people want a health facility to be safe. And in fact, I think we should use the regulation piece more aggressively against some places like the so-called crisis pregnancy centers that aren't required to tell the truth, aren't required to have a healthcare professional there, are often misleading. People have no idea. They think they do have healthcare professionals. They assume their standards. They assume a healthcare provider is required to tell the truth. And they're neither a healthcare provider nor a truth teller. So that's clear. But the scene has radically changed. And I think actually in some states, and this is something that Ohio really researched and struggled with, some of these initiatives in some ways are a little too cautious. Mainly not because the groups are too cautious, but because the politicians are too cautious. And they think they've got to add in something about restrictions or some viability language or whatever.
I was going to get in there.
Yeah, well, I'll hand it off to you because you do not need to add that stuff anymore.
No, you don't. And this was a big fight in Ohio about whether or not we included viability or not. And it's all from fear, you know. It's a double-edged sword because you put it in there assuming to bring in moderate voters who want some restrictions, but then fetal viability isn't like a real thing that voters have a concept of. And so we saw this in the messaging from our opposition. They were hitting us very hard on fetal viability. And it was something that, you know, those of us who are more progressive in the abortion space and really do feel like there shouldn't be any restrictions on abortion care, we're really frustrated by, because it didn't really need to be there in the first place. And we don't think that it was that supportive to any voters. And it did add a lot of stigma to folks who do need later care. And that's already so stigmatized and so hard to access. And a lot of times those are some of the most empowering stories of folks who were actually able to get that care and how important it was to them and their families. And they're being entirely left out of these conversations in a lot of states.
Jennifer, you want to get in there? You look like you want to get in there.
Maggie was absolutely right. I think, you know, we often do the work of the antis ourselves, right? By tying ourselves to viability. One of the things that legislators often tell me is, well, viability is the sticking point. And I say, that's not even a thing. You are actually taking and making the decision for someone else. You are not the authoritarian in this, right? And so we can actually do this work without you being the deciding factor for when someone should have an abortion. That is not what we need you to be doing. You know, we want you to remove all the barriers so that, you know, abortion no matter what.
The other thing I would say is that they are using this language, abortion, that candidates are scared of, abortion until the day of delivery. And like I said, Americans bad at math, bad at biology. They have no idea how many weeks are on a pregnancy, even when they themselves have been pregnant, or the spouse of someone pregnant, the partner. But the interesting thing here is when you ask people, and Kate Gormley, who's on our phone, and I want to acknowledge for being the leader of the work in our firm, and Alicia Snell, people think that half the abortions are late and half the abortions are early, like just because, like, well, it's got to be half and half, right? Proving again, Americans really bad at math. And when you tell people, we're talking about 1% to 2%, people volunteer. Wow, something must have gone really wrong. And it's like, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. So let's leave it to the doctor and the family, not some politician and their ignorant political view. And these debates are all massively easier now than they were pre-Dobbs. We have paid a horrible price with Dobbs, but at least we have gotten some clarity in our system. But it's not the voters who are holding on to this old way of thinking. It's a lot of the politicians who are holding on to this old way of thinking.
I'm actually really glad you brought that up. So I'm from Alabama. When Doug Jones was running for office, he was running against a candidate, Roy Moore, who was a known pedophile, right, in Alabama. Like it was known, we all knew. the girl I went to high school with, she reached out to me on Facebook. She says, I'm not quite sure who to vote for. Doug Jones, who prosecuted the KKK, right? The bombers, or Doug Jones, who was a pedophile. She said, because Roy Moore supports abortion up until birth. And so I like, generally I don't respond to people like this, but for her, I was going to, and I said, do you realize what you're saying? And like, when you break down kind of how Celinda just did for us, she said, oh, why doesn't anyone tell me this? I said, it's all a political ploy, right? That is all part of the plan. And so once we start actually breaking down facts for the everyday person, not the folks that were already like staunch anti, but the folks like her, I ultimately, I think she didn't vote, but fine, like whatever. You didn't vote for her, I agree. But the thing was, she just said, like, why don't people tell me this? That's the story that we need to be telling.
Yeah, my mom, I was brought up in a pro-life household. My mom was pro-life my entire life. And she happened to come see me speak during this campaign and happened to hear me talk about what I see on the ground and what I see with our patients. And then we went out to dinner and talked about some of the laws that our legislature has put through. And she's a doctor. And I talked about one of the ectopic pregnancy reimplantation laws that was introduced in Ohio last year. And her eyes just got so wide. It was like, why does nobody tell me these things? And I was like, because they know that if they actually told you what they think, that you would not vote for them. And they're counting on it. They're counting on you not understanding how dedicated they are to criminalizing pregnancy. And I think that was something that we talked a lot in Ohio this year. Is Ohio is 5th in pregnancy criminalizations in the nation.
Wow.
So it is a huge threat to Ohioans who have the capacity to get pregnant if there are restrictions on pregnancy and abortion in this state. And I think that really resonated with some voters, that they realized how real this was. When the 6-week ban went into effect, we heard everybody in my community, all the women, all the people who can get pregnant in my friend group, were terrified of getting pregnant, even if they had previously wanted to have kids. Even in that time period, we're ready to have kids because they know what that means for their ability to get maternal health care and how impactful. And we've seen this in the South, especially as abortion restrictions have gone into place. We've seen maternity wards closing down. We've seen an increase in maternal and infant mortality rates. It's not just about abortion. I mean, it's incredibly important and to center abortion, but it has wide-ranging impacts across all reproductive health care, regardless of whether or not you want to have children.
Before I ask a question of Jennifer about what's playing out sort of in candidates' minds in some of this, because we've gone to like their bigger end game, does anyone else want to add anything else about what they see as like the bigger end game on the anti-abortion side here? Just so people crystallize sort of.
Well, I'll tell you what voters think. They think this is about controlling women, and they think there's a broader agenda here. And you have women 24 years old, 18 years old, and women 74 years old volunteering this. Again, to me, what's really interesting is the clarity of the voters when they are provided even the most remote and simple information versus the befuddlement of our political establishment. But they respond to it. And words that never tested well, like rights and control, are testing very well right now because they get the drill. So people think overwhelmingly this is about. And when African-American women, religious African-American women who used to have pre-Roe some reservations, although I might say they always voted very pro-choice. Now it's like, who do you think's affected the most? Black women will be affected the most, of course. And that decline in healthcare, Maggie, that you spoke so eloquently about, will be affected the most by that. So I think that there's just a clarity here. And one of the things that I'm glad, and Melissa, that you had this kind of forum, is we keep trying to make this complicated when in fact this is quite simple. And there are issues that are quite complicated in voters' mind, but this is not one of them. In the post-Dobbs world, this is very clear to voters, and we just have to get as clear as the voters are.
That is an excellent segue to something I want to ask you, Jennifer, because a number of people have noted that like actually what's kind of happening here is like the candidates haven't moved as much as the voters have, or sometimes we haven't, you know, caught up with like the real sea change here. You work a lot with, you know, those folks and those obviously those who are already sort of progressive and doing their thing, but what kind of shifts have you seen with them on this issue as of late? What more is there to be done? Any observations from kind of the candidate side?
I mean, I mentioned earlier that the Virginia ads and them naming abortion and talking about abortion. I would be really shocked to see next year if if candidates aren't leaning into abortion. We know that, I mean, we've seen how it has played out. You know, progressive candidates, Democrats, they will know. Look, we've seen what happened in even, you know, Kentucky, Ohio, Montana, all of these states. And that abortion really is the issue that I need to talk about because it's on the forefront of folks' mind. But I would also say that it's not just the running for office, right? Because once you get into office, you've been elected, now the voters want to see you actually do something, right? So it's not just talk about it on the campaign trail. What are the bold policies that you're going to be implementing and pushing forward once you are, you know, in office? And that's the next phase. And really looking to see, you know, how they're going to respond. And I say this not just as like in states that are, you know, expanded access states, so states that have expanded, you know, or protected abortion, but in states where, you know, restrictions and barriers are there too, because voters and constituents want to see not only that you are protecting or defending against restrictions, but that you yourself are committed to doing a bold vision for that state. Everyone, regardless of the state, and wants to know that your candidate, your official is fighting for you, regardless if you're in Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, New York, right? All of them want to know that there is some sort of visionary piece that you're going to be working on. And so like this is just a shout out for folks in Georgia who are pushing for, you know, the Reproductive Freedom Act, right? That this is a bold vision that they're still pushing and wanting to see that their elected officials are going to be not only running on this issue, but when you get into office, you are going to do something.
Love it. I have one more question before I have a question, the last question for you all about what you're hopeful about. And then we are, for folks still hanging in and watching, we're so appreciative of you. We will have time for questions, and I'll get to at least most of the ones that have come in. To your point, Celinda, about sometimes we overcomplicate things, and Maggie, because you brought up the care deserts. Last thing on sort of abortion, sort of maybe messaging strategy and approach. A lot of folks kind of say, oh my God, we got to like put the information out there more, like about specific impacts or impacts outside of abortion, or like, you know, for example, on maternal care. And, you know, you could go very wide with that. Or there's just the like talk about the actual impact on taking away people's rights. I feel like, or you could do a both and. Does anybody have any opinions or data that actually speaks to what makes the most sense? And I ask this from a place of like, maybe this is another area we're making it more complicated on some level than it needs to be. But I'm curious your thoughts.
Can I just say one thing? The first thing that I will say is that it's not an either or. Abortion is not the solution to the maternal health crisis, right? Or the maternal health issue in this country. We need maternal health and we need access to abortion. I think that folks are like, oh, you know, maternal health is so bad in this country, and so we really need abortion. No. We need sound maternal health and we need access to abortion. And I just want to make sure that we are clear that it is not an either or, that abortion is not the solution. Yes, we need access to abortion, regardless of where you live or your zip code. But you also need providers in your community. You need maternal health. We need all of these things.
I think there's a long-term strategy and a short-term strategy. And I think, and this is one of the things we can celebrate about the Ohio victory, because they had such a short time frame, but I think they were operating on two fronts, Megan, and you were a major part of that. We need to educate people. There is no question that one of the things that has really helped, nobody in America would have a conversation here and wouldn't bring up one of the cases. I read about the woman who had to go from Ohio to Indiana. I read about the person who was in the parking lot in Oklahoma and the doctors had to turn her back and say, when you start bleeding, come back in. I can't do anything. They've read about the family where the woman is in very serious trouble and they're trying to drive, the husband is driving her across state lines with the 2 kids in the back. I mean, this is a case where storytelling really helped. It's a case where doctors talking about what they see real, and healthcare providers, nurses and other providers really helps. Planned Parenthood did a strategy a while ago with the Tennessee initiative, which unfortunately lost at the last minute, but people have no idea what a clinic looks like, a healthcare facility looks like. They have no idea who's in there. They really want counseling. They have no idea that counseling is provided. They have no idea that counseling is provided for transgender care. And I would say this, they're trying to link transgender and abortion. And we are very strong on abortion, but we have a lot of work to do on transgender care. And we need to educate people. Right now in America, people guess that 25% of Americans are transgender. Now, I personally have no problem living in that world, but my God, people, that's absurd. Are you talking about 1 in every 4 people you know is transgender? So people have no idea what we're talking about, and allows for misinformation and disinformation and fear mongering. And, these are things so we need the long-term strategy of educating people. And then we need candidates are not good educators, respectfully, and campaigns, 30-second ads are not good education mediums. And we need them just to enforce the choice.
Thanks, Beth.
I think to both Jennifer and Linda's points, so much of this is about education, and campaigns, candidates are not good forums for that. But it's also the place that gets a lot of investment in funders to do that work. And so I think it really behooves funders to look to the organizations that are on the ground, that have the community supports, that have the comms. AFO did a huge push around comms, educating not only about the ballot initiative, but making sure that voters knew how to access their right to vote, knew what their rights were, knew how to find the SOS website, every little bit of it, because that's where folks are looking for their information a lot of times. And it's so much easier to have these conversations when you're not trying to do it in a 30-second spot that needs to reach everyone in Central Ohio, when you can have a conversation with an actual voter and teach them how to have these conversations in their families. Because even as broad as our coalition was, we couldn't reach everybody. We needed people in our communities who felt empowered and felt educated enough to have these conversations in their own families, in their own places of work. We heard stories about people organizing their whole workplaces to go vote together, to vote yes on issue 1, organizing their whole family. And that's, I think, what really put us over the edge, is that our community felt empowered and invigorated to take this issue into their own hands and talk about it and really encourage each other.
That's really beautiful, Maggie. On that note, I'm going to ask you all just to share one last reflection before we go to, we have time for a couple of questions that have come in, but can you share something about what you're feeling hopeful about, either in terms of abortion access generally or the 2024 elections? Something making you hopeful.
Well, I'll start. The only thing that's making me hopeful about the 2024 elections is what happened on Tuesday and the abortion issue, frankly. I think it's the strongest thing we have going for us. And the voice, the clarity and the voice of women, the willingness to make this a decision and a clear choice, the willingness to be mobilized. I would say, if I can leave one thought for everybody who's on this webinar, we must register more young people and get them out to vote. And this is a strong issue to do both of those actions on. I was in a meeting of funders who said, well, and Maggie, you and Jennifer, you will laugh at this since we all do campaigns together, who said, well, we're not going to invest in registration. It doesn't work. And that's just such an absurdly stupid statement. I hardly knew what to say. So I said, okay, well, here's the deal. 40% of Gen Zers who have voted are not the same place they were 4 years ago. So if you can win races by eliminating 40% of your base, then you go for it. Don't register anybody. But if you think you might lose under that scenario, you better invest in registration.
I would say one thing that is giving me hope is what I said before. We have a fighting chance now. We have the specter of criminalization is just a little less dark in Ohio right now. And I know there are so many incredible organizers, advocates, and storytellers in this state that are maybe resting a little bit this week, but come Monday morning, we are back at it. And we're not going to stop fighting until we have full abortion access in this state. My organization has been in this fight for 30 years, and we aren't going anywhere. We're staying, and we're going to keep fighting until everybody in our community has not just abortion access, but the ability to create the family in a healthy, safe environment that they want.
I love that. I'm going to probably bridge off of that, right? Maggie focused a lot of, what they're, really looking forward to. And I think one of the things that I'm just really optimistic about is how we're talking about community care and care in a lot of different ways of how do we take care of one another. What is it going to take for all of us to get and have access to care in communities, that knowing that I shouldn't have to drive or leave my community to get the hair help that I deserve and need. And what I'm also optimistic about is the way, I would be remiss if I said this because I work with state legislators, right? The way that more state legislators are coming into the fold, right? They're wanting to talk about it. There may not be out in front and center, but behind the scenes, they're calling and saying, I want to know more about this issue. Talk to me about self-managed abortion. We did these interviews with state legislators. One of our legislators actually interviewed other legislators about their knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs around self-managed abortion. And from that, other legislators started to run bills on decriminalization of self-managed abortion. And so this idea of how legislators are showing up, talking across state lines, seeing what's happening in other states and what they can take back into their states is really giving me a lot of hope.
So appreciative of all of you. That filled me with lots of hope, and I'm just deeply, deeply grateful for this conversation, but more importantly, your work in the world. So thank you. With that, I am going to make sure we have time for at least a couple of questions that have come in. There are a number. And I'm going to go first to one that is specific at first to Ohio, but then goes broader about sort of how people are getting information in elections these days. So the question is sort of in looking at the results of both Ohio's, special election in August and November in particular, it really seemed that the way voters are receiving and seeking out information to support their vote seems to be shifting. It always also kind of looked that way when reviewing kind of the timeline of how people were spending in different ways in the campaigns. So the question is that the person who's posing the question is saying they're surmising this is sort of generational. Younger generations aren't as interested in things like billboards and yard signs, but social media discussions. What have you all seen? And it can be outside of Ohio too. What have you all seen to support this, or what other factors are you recognizing as a means to connect with this younger generation of voters?
Yeah, so in Ohio, we learned a lot, I think, about where folks are getting their information, and we also saw some barriers. We had some logistical stuff that impacted our ability to get yard signs out early on, but we also saw that by centering social media campaigns, creating online forums for folks to share information, it really galvanized people, because that was something where they could feel tied to the campaign and connected to other people across their state and energize each other throughout the process without necessarily having to have huge staffing infrastructure to support these volunteers. It really allowed them to self-organize in some ways that kind of drove us crazy, but also inspiring and powerful. And I think allowed especially younger voters to feel more informed and feel like the campaign was talking to them and cared about what they think, and was more engaged with getting information to them in a really powerful way.
Celinda, do you have any data or anything to
Yeah,
share?
I mean, I would say three things. I would say number one, we need to do it all, and the other side is certainly doing it all. I think what the other side is has been stronger, and I think Ohio was a real response to that, is using social media and using it early to plant doubts. And so, but I think the best campaigns are integrated. Secondly, I would say the number one source of information for swing voters is friends and family. Now, some of us could suggest, okay, maybe we need to get people new friends and family, but that's going to be hard. These kinds of personal conversations and authentic conversations really are important. And one of the things you see is that women in particular, who are very hesitant to divide their personal networks and very hesitant to pass on information, when abortion is the topic, they will pass it on. They will be aggressive. They will tell their spouses how to think instead of vice versa. So I think empowering people with the information, the ability to have these conversations, and Ohio and the Ohio grassroots was just, and Maggie, you were a leader in this, was just superb at this, and Jennifer, you helped invent how to do this. So that very, very important. But frankly, you got to do it all, and you got to do it integrated, because they're going to do it all.
Mm-hmm. All right, going in a different direction. And this, I believe, Maggie, you talked about the stigma question a tiny bit in how it played in Ohio, but one of our listeners wants to know whether you all think that public discussions that are happening for the ballot initiatives and the referendums, and in all the actual saying abortion and messaging about abortion in candidate elections, is having a net effect of destigmatizing abortion within these states that have been traditionally more restrictive or highly restrictive. Net positive effect, net negative, neutral? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you seeing?
So I think, it depends on which place of information we're talking about. I think in more traditional comms, there was definitely an increase in stigma, unfortunately, because so much of the conversations around fetal viability and restrictions is rooted in stigma. But to Celinda's point, so much of the power in this campaign came from those personal conversations. And I think that's where a lot of the stigma busting happens. When every time I was asked to come in to talk about the ballot initiative, when people ask me what they can do, my number one thing that I ask folks to do is to say the word abortion and talk about it with the people in your lives, because you will be so shocked once you start talking about abortion publicly, how many people trust you with their intimate stories, and how many people will talk to you about what their experience with reproductive health care has been. And I think it really opens up a lot of barriers where this conversation that has been so stigmatized and so shameful is brought into the light, and people feel supported and feel connected to their community and feel more empowered to continue talking about this conversation.
Thank you. All right. Now we are going to a question about misinformation. That's not really the right phrase, but you know what I mean. The question is, in this age of rampant misinformation, and we've discussed how misinformation was used in many of the campaigns, and especially Ohio, what are the most effective strategies that everyone has found to present facts, research, and data, in particular, like hard facts, about abortion and reproductive health care without alienating or sort of triggering defensiveness or doubt from voters?
So I'm going to start with this one, because I think there are some threads that Celinda has kind of been dropping, like telling us over and over that most Americans can't do math, right? Like, we don't know numbers. And so this person had mentioned the story that I had told about the person in Alabama. I think the thing that brought her along was that I didn't lead with X number percent. Did you know the research says this? She didn't care, right? She needed to know a story in that moment. And that kind of personalized it for her. I knew a lot about her. I knew that she had some miscarriages, like we talked about, humanizing that piece. I did this with my own mother, who had miscarriages, and I talked about it. Did you know that let's have this conversation. So it wasn't that I led with research or data, mostly because that most people can't conceptualize what number that means. A lot of folks try to do that with legislators, and legislators don't actually know what you're saying. They're like, oh, okay, they will nod and be like, yes, thank you. But in reality, they can't conceptualize that the research. And so we have to translate and do that. And so I think that there was something like the theme that we've all kind of said is that storytelling has been really helping, talking to those, engaging those trusted people in our lives, our community, our family, our friends has been really helpful, to do this without alienating or bringing up that defensiveness.
And I think to Jennifer's point, part of that is because when you're sharing facts and statistics with folks, it doesn't change the image they have in their mind of who needs an abortion or who might need reproductive health care. If you get them to relate that to a person that they've actually met and talked to and care about, then that changes their mind. For my mom, it was getting her to think about these folks as her patients who needed care in the past, and that she was able to latch onto and realize that her political opinions were impacting her patients, even if it was in a different way than she had originally conceptualized.
There is one caveat to that, right? Is that I think when we do it, there is a way that we have sometimes done it where it stigmatizes, oh, this person is deserving of an abortion. This is a good abortion versus a bad abortion. So I often caution us of telling those stories that are like, this person was more deserving of that abortion versus someone else. And so that's just the one flag that I would say there.
Yeah, I want to come back to the disinformation part of this too and say there are 3 rules on disinformation, right? One is don't repeat the charge. We continually repeat the charge. Well, first of all, that just ups the algorithm so that it gets heard more. So do not repeat the charge. We think we have to repeat it to refute it. No, you don't. Number 2, remember, and Ohio really got this on the second round after the language had been rewritten. They did a brilliant job of this. The person who frames the debate wins the debate, not the person with the best facts or stats or most authoritative citation. The person that frames the debate wins the debate. So keep it framed. And our framing is easy now. We're making this more complicated. Their framing is hard. Our framing is easy. Keep on our message. And then thirdly, repetition matters. Get to our message. The most important thing in refuting misinformation is to get to our message. Our message beats their message. If our message didn't beat their message, we'd have to worry about refutation. Our message is beating their message more than 2 to 1. Get to our message.
Thank you.
I know we're at time, but there's just one question in there that I just wanted to quickly, and then I'm happy to share my contact information to follow up further. It's around the Michigan constitutional amendment. And so it's filed, I believe yesterday. I'm losing track of time at this point, but it's saying that it's the constitutional amendment is unconstitutional under federal law. And so it's the idea is that it's depriving the fetus's right to live. They're doing, the antis for a long time have been looking at personhood, establishing personhood, and this is kind of their next kind of ploy. This is their ploy in Michigan to, the voters said what they want, and now they're looking for how do we undo that. And so I'm happy to talk offline further about Michigan's constitutional amendment and the lawsuit that was filed.
Thank you for lifting that up. And I'm glad you did, because apologies to everyone. We did not get to every single question that you posed, but it was such a rich and important discussion. There's so much more to follow. I think that last question shows you win and then you're never quite won. Nothing is ever fully won. We shouldn't get complacent. I'm sorry, there was a good one in there about people also in access states and complacency and why this matters, but we really appreciate everybody's participation here. Thank you to our brilliant and wonderful panelists. Thank you for all your work, and thank you everyone for your time. Thanks for joining us. And I should answer that there will be a recording of this was made and will be sent to everyone who participated. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.